these days, in the current political conversation in the country, there's a lot of this reference to God and the Bible. So what fits really good, if we have gross inequalities and if we have lots of poverty, the Bible tells us, don't worry, we have to, the meek shall inherit the earth. So don't worry about it. And besides, who was Somerset? Ever heard the name of Somerset Maugham? He wrote a famous book called On Human Bondage way back. See, here's a quote I used to mention in my classroom. Look, God must love the poor. He made so many of them. All right, now, go on.
I didn't expect you to get on the Bible, but I'd like to make a point.
Yeah.
The early Christian community held all things in common, and it wasn't just a temporary sort of thing like some preachers will tell you. It lasted at least 200 years. Tertullian said, we hold all things in common except our lives.
St. Thomas Aquinas was a socialist, for God's sake. He used to argue, you are your brother's keeper. That's the Christian thing to do. Share your wealth. Isn't that how it was? In any case, for a few minutes, maybe the panel people here, you have a question for each other, perhaps? Any comments on each other?
I have a question for the economist. Something I find curious, you don't have to listen to much NPR to hear every week or two that unemployment stays steady, and yet banks in particular seem to be having record profits quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter. And you hear that, well, if only the banks would release some of their savings and get money flowing in through lending, then medium-sized and small businesses could hire, we could deal with this unemployment problem. And yet that doesn't happen. So I was wondering if you could, from an economist's point of view, speculate a bit on the causes of that, A, and B, comment on what, if anything, either the market, such that it does stuff, can do to make more jobs happen, or the government can do to put pressure on the banks to get some of this capital flowing again, and so that businesses could hire. Or if I'm just completely misguided, that's the other thing.
No, I have a little bit different take on it. I think that when you have a financial meltdown the way that we had, 3 years ago, it has serious long-term consequences to the economy, and it affects. One thing about the banking system is that when you have a meltdown of the banking system, it affects almost every decision maker in the economy. So it isn't just the lenders that are holding back, it's also the borrowers. So when a borrower walks into a bank to borrow money, both the borrower and the lender are scared out of their minds. The borrower is afraid to borrow money and the lender is afraid to loan the money. And I think you see that same problem all the way through the economy. You see a reluctant on consumers to spend, firms reluctant to hire. Everybody is, it's kind of a fallacy of composition where we're all pulled in, right? We're all reduced our spending and our economic activities because we think things are going to get worse. And so
things do
get worse, right? Because one person's spending is another person's income in the system. So I see it as not just that the banks aren't loaning the money. I think it's the borrowers aren't borrowing and the firms are not expanding, right? And I think there's a general uncertainty about the economic future that pervades everything.
I'd like to comment on bankers. Probably maybe 6 or 7 years ago, if a borrower came in the bank and you look at their debt service coverage, we wanted them to cover that debt payment by 110%, so there's a 10% margin in there. That worked really well. Profits were good. Most of them went way over that. That was fine. So then we have this meltdown of the banks because of what the banks did, basically. So then the federal government comes in with their loan policy. 72 pages, and when you read through that, you realize that you'll never loan to another person as long as you live. The debt service coverage that was 110% when profits were good, now that profits are weak for small businesses that really need to borrow, Now we require 140%. You know what that did to borrowers? They were not able to borrow. Their profits were squeezed. You have a federal mandate there that says you will do this. It doesn't work. Probably a lot of this $2 trillion in cash is in banks. They're not lending. They can't violate the federal loan policy. Again, here's an inequality coming from people who, I don't know what they're trying to accomplish, but it's not working.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that there are actually 3 philosophers on the panel here. Steve took every single philosophy class that I offered, and he aced every single one. But he ends up in a different person's profession. I'd like to talk about this efficiency of economy versus equity. If you look at the figures, the GDP growth in Europe is not that far behind the United States. And currently, the fastest growing economies in the Western Hemisphere or in Europe are Sweden, the most equal country in the world, and Germany. In terms of losing manufacturing base, we certainly have done in the United States. But countries like Austria, Germany, and I don't know the figures from Sweden, have maintained their manufacturing base. Through the Great Recession, Germany created jobs with the help of the German government. If you take out Spain and Greece, the unemployment rate in Europe is about 5%. If you leave in Ireland and Greece, the budget deficit is an average of 4.2%. It's been going down gradually. I look at the back end of The Economist every week. So I don't think we have to play this game of more equity, you lose out in terms of economic growth. If you lose out a little bit in economic growth, I also want to emphasize what Ghazi was saying. I'd love to have 5 weeks vacation. Americans work themselves to the bone, 2 to 3 jobs. And many of them don't even take the vacation that they're offered. We're talking about not only child well-being here, but human well-being. And I get a lot of responses. For example, I wrote an article about Finland and how its students had succeeded so well. And on a blog in Pocatello, I get responses like, we can't be like Europe. It's impossible.
Why not?
It's a defeatist attitude, and the fact is that in the 1950s and 60s, we were like Europe, with higher tax rates than Europe has today. Those years, those 20 years, were the highest economic growth for this nation, with a 35% unionized rate. The only thing that we didn't succeed in was universal health care. And we had a chance with Truman, even Eisenhower toyed with the idea. It was a tragic mistake. If we had done it then, instead of trying to do it now, we would be in much better shape. Healthcare costs are just going to kill us because we didn't make the right decisions right after the war.
All right. We can now open it up for conversation here. Rula, you're ladies first. Go ahead.
I don't think that's equitable.
Okay.
We're
gonna go first.
I'll say that, you go first. Yeah. Speaking about whether it's trade-offs or profit and power, are we seeing, and it is all about economics and equity, rights, doing the right, having things right done for the right for the right, or the right not to have things else done. Are we concerned at all about the notion of the common good, or are we looking at more individualized actions? Are we constantly shrinking away from this? Are we becoming more and more segregated, just very individual units that don't care? That's my question, or my comment.
I'll just say briefly that I think that you might have taken that away from my remarks, that I think the proper home for the language of rights is the individual, and that these issues would, we would gain from moving away from individualistic ways of thinking about things and conceive of ourselves as a community, members of a community first and foremost. And when you put things in those terms, I think that, I don't know, this is speculative, right? But that we're more inclined to take these issues on head on when we think of ourselves as members of a community first, rather than couching these issues in the language of rights that just fits much more naturally at the level of the individual than the collective. So I'm on board with you with thinking that that discussing this in a slightly different way might help bring us together.
But Graham, we as a nation are signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Sure.
So that declaration commits us to the common good.
Right, but we can talk, the issue is not whether we have rights or whether there are rights. The issue is how do we couch this discourse to make progress on the matter.
And how is profit, for example, is it profit of the individual, or are we looking at, what about the profit of Moscow? What about the profit of the downtown Main Street, for example, or the collective power of individuals? I don't think we think along those lines. I mean,
Social profits versus private profits. Yeah, Alan? Yeah.
I appreciate very much your remarks, BJ, because I think that you get to the heart of the problem in our society, which really is this profit motive. And you raise the question as to basically we have the opportunity in the United States to speak out and change it. And I think that where this is the most disappointing to me is on the health issue. Frankly, I can understand that many other questions that people don't rise up to question. But on the health issue, where almost every family in this country is affected, and where it's so obvious that our system is one of the worst systems in the developed world, and that the proof is there so easily to see, my question is, why are the American people not in the streets about healthcare in particular? Can you explain to me why?
I would ask you that. I don't understand either. And Steve Peterson talked about the fabulously wealthy people, the sports stars. Are they worth it? That we cherish them. And why is that? Where are our values here? And healthcare certainly is a priority. But why aren't we in the streets demonstrating? Our healthcare system is broken.
Well, I might suggest one of the reasons I think we're not is because I think that the myth is perpetuated in this country, for example, against all the evidence that this is the best healthcare system in the world, where of course it is if you're a millionaire, but lots of other myths are perpetuated, both in the university and the schools, and the people who rise up to question them are frequently putting themselves in a dangerous position. Now we're far away from McCarthyism, but still I would suggest that people who would speak in the classrooms in this country, for example, for a socialist system, and come out and avail themselves as socialists, will be running a great risk.
Please. Yes. Yes.
I have a question for the whole panel. You've talked about the research you've done and where you are and where you're coming from in your individual areas. If each of you had one suggestion to make as to something we could do, change, add, what would it be? What's an issue, a something? Because it's all very well to talk up here, and I understand that. I understand where BJ's coming from. I understand where Nick is coming from. If I could wave my magic wand, I would unionize the workforce, and I would raise taxes, and I would do a whole bunch of other things. However, I don't have my magic wand tonight. So I'm asking you for a suggestion, a goal, a proposed law, or whatever, that might get us on the path to doing something about this.
Take it on. I'll be controversial here. I think the first thing we need to do is look at our taxes and restructure them. Our taxes have really been, for the last several years, have really been a disincentive to the middle class. It's crunched. We want, you know, the rich want it to work more and more and more, and I think it's probably kind of bled dry. So I would revise the tax codes immediately. and I would say universal health care.
State and federal?
Taxes?
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you.
And universal health care, we can circle the wagons, and we have all of these other things. If you look at healthcare reform, it was written by the insurance companies. Are we going to accomplish what we want by 2014? In the meantime, the costs of healthcare are going to go sky high even before we get to 2014, and then what? You know, eventually this is leading to a single payer system anyway. Medicare is really the most efficient that we have, but the insurance companies don't want that, whereas the wealth and the power is with the insurance companies.
Thank you.
Well, I would take a little more, or I would take a little more practical standpoint. I think that, colleagues of mine that would listen to basically this conversation would be absolutely appalled. They're thinking the size of government is way too big, way too intrusive, and that all of that should be scaled back in a dramatic way. And I think that we have a conversation in the country in which we have two groups that are talking past one another. I frankly have never seen the politics be more polarized than are now. Polarized to the point that you can't even agree on the basic facts, let alone try to formulate policy. So
How would you fix it? What can we do?
well, I have some practical ones. One is in terms of corporations, I would require for the top paid employees, the stockholders to vote on the CEO salary packages. So they know exactly, and they have some sort of range of salaries in the top people. If they're traders in a financial firm, if the stockholders have to vote on the CEO packages, I think that's one. The other is, I wouldn't change the marginal tax rate, but I would essentially close the loopholes and move to more of a proportional system. So I would get rid of all of not all of them, but as many as I could, the holes in the tax system. Healthcare is a much more difficult issue, I guess. I think the mean doesn't hold. It's one of those areas where we either need to move to a more European system, where the government acts as what they call a single buyer, a monopsony to hold price down, or a national insurance company does that, or we really need to go to a completely free market system where there's price competition, and I just don't think the current system holds. I don't have an easy solution to that, but I guess that would be the practical ones would be changing the tax code, again, not raising the rate, but eliminating the tax loopholes and having the stockholders actually vote, tighten up the principal. I think is a principal agent problem with it.
Nick?
Well, I would agree with all the proposals, not only tax reform, but increases in taxes to get our infrastructure back up to speed. We have not only some of the lowest internet speeds in our state, but across the world, we have some of the lowest internet speeds. South Korea is incredibly wired. Everybody is on high speed there. So we need to really rethink the whole idea about taxes. Clinton raised taxes and created 22 million jobs.
Say again, Nick.
Clinton raised taxes and created 22 million jobs. The Europeans have high tax rates, and they can still produce jobs, and they can still grow an economy, and they can support human well-being at all levels. There's no reason why we, with the political will and some good education, people refuse to learn even about things in other states, let alone in other nations. So education would be very important there. So not only tax reform, but increased taxes and universal health care. Medicare for all. Clean up the Medicare system, make it more efficient. Medicare for all.
Was it the Citizens United case a couple of years ago that allowed for the explosion of super PACs or whatever that's going on now?
Yes.
I think that's one element that I think we've left out of the conversation so far, is the difficulty of a democracy to function as a democracy when the people are not represented proportionally to their voices as citizens. when money can equate to speech and can outweigh the voices of individuals. Undoing what has ever allowed that to take place would, at least, I don't know, would hope would create a better context in which our voices actually were proportionally representative to our condition and not to the amount of income we have.
Thank you.
You want a suggestion from me too?
I'm going to look for that magic wand.
Yeah, magic one. There is a practical one, and it fits in all of this. It is coming from an economist, a little bit different because economists don't talk in terms of anything being, there's no such thing as a free good. But I often think in terms of how about each one of us volunteering more in our communities and cities and get involved in terms of being meaningful to each other in so many, even in economic terms. The spirit of volunteer, aside from the other more tangible things, I'm talking about the spirit of volunteerism. If we can bring that, I think Obama and Michelle Obama, everybody is talking about it. So maybe that's something we need to do more, getting involved.